So welcome to the Connecting Commands Together and Mastering Objects module. Really the goal of this module is to think about, well, I have all these great capabilities in PowerShell, and a lot of them are driven by this PowerShell pipeline capability. So I want to dive into that a little bit, understanding how we can parse and use objects, and then some of the tricks we can do. Now, before we get started there, just a quick note on the semicolon. In some languages, I have to put a semicolon at the end of the command. I do not have to do that in PowerShell, but you can if you want to. So if I was to go to my PowerShell window, I can absolutely just write a command, hello world. I can, if I want, add a semicolon to the end. It doesn't do anything different. Now, where I can use that is if for some reason I want to run multiple commands on one line. So I could do write hello world, and then I could also write output hello sun. So the semicolon enables me to actually run separate commands on the same line. Now, what I need to be really careful of when I do things like this is imagine I was going to say, well, let's get all of the processes beginning with A. Okay. And I'm also going to get all of the services beginning with A. Now, I could put those together. I could semicolon this and say get service A. And because what's happening is I'm keeping the objects, you'll notice now it's kind of changed the format a little bit. So I've got the processes, and then instead of outputting it as a table for the services, now it changed to a list. But it's still okay, I'm getting the information I want. What I mustn't now do though, is to now try and pipe this output to something else. Because I'm going to get now two different types of objects, that's really not going to work well. So yes, I can put multiple commands on a line. I can use the semicolon to separate those, but don't have objects going on down the line. So that's kind of that format on the slide. So now we understand, well, there is a semicolon, but you're probably not going to use it very often. What about actually keeping these objects? Now, a key point is that PowerShell does not convert output to text. The output stays as the actual objects. So if I was to jump back over again, if I do my get, should we do get process A star again, there's a great command called get member. This will show me all of the information about this object. And what is an object? You can think about an object really like anything in the real world. As an object, I'm an object. I'm a human being, despite what some people might say. I'm an object and I have properties. When I was younger, I had a hair color. I don't anymore. I would have a property that I am bald. I have properties that I have blue eyes. So those are things that are descriptions, things that I have. I have 5 fingers on one hand. And then I have methods. These are things that I can do. I can walk, I can run, I can jump. So I have properties, things that describe me, things I have, and then I have method, things I can do. And an object in PowerShell, which is based on .NET, is exactly the same. So if I look at a get member of process, I can see, well, it has a number of properties, a container, a machine name, an ID, some kind of useful things. I have a process name. I also have some alias properties, things that just make it easier for me to see. Maybe if I'm outputting in a table format, I can shorten the table headings. So I have name, which is actually just an alias to process name. I have handles, that is just an alias property to handle count. And then I also have methods, things I can do. I can close a process. I can kill a process. I can start a process. So I'm getting this raw object. And you don't always have to do get member. You can just shorten it to GM. So we're keeping them as the actual objects. That gives us a lot of power because then commands down the chain can look at the individual properties. They could call the various methods. And what we want to do in PowerShell is we think about keeping the objects as long as we can. We don't want to convert it to text. Now, what's happening all the way at the end, if I just do get process, is it's outputting it to screen. So at the end, it gets to a default, and the default is, well, I'll display it. But if I have lots of commands in that pipeline, I want to keep it as an object as long as I can, because that's going to enable me to do all of the more advanced manipulation on it. Whereas if I output it to strings very quickly, well, then it's very hard to manipulate and do interesting things with strings. Strings don't have all these great methods that I can actually use to manipulate. If it's just a string, it's much harder to work out, well, this part of the string is the handle count, so I can go and sort by handle count and those types of actions. So we're keeping the objects as objects. This means I can do these great chainings of the various things I might want to do. For example, I'm not going to look at VM network adapters, but I could create a Notepad instance. So Notepad's kind of sitting over there. We'll just keep it so we can see it in the window. Now I could do get process. And one of those somewhere up here, I'm going to find Notepad. There it is. Well, I could send that to where object, and I could say, now $_ here, and we're going to talk more about this. $_ is basically representing each object in turn coming down the pipeline. So for all of those processes, one by one, they're going to be sent kind of into this evaluation. So I'm going to look for where the name is equal to Notepad. And there it is. But that is still the object. It's done that check, but it's still sending me, what is it sending me? It's still keeping it as a process. It'll have all the attributes. I still have all the methods. And so at this point, there's a number of different things I could do here, but I could absolutely it disappeared. So because I'm keeping the object, I'm passing it down the line. Now I could spin it up again. We can actually try a different approach based off of the raw object itself. So let's just do this. So just like math at school, when I put something in brackets, that's going to get evaluated. So this is going to spit out the object. Well, the object has methods. So there's my definition. And I can run it. See what I'm doing there? I had the object, and then I can call the methods from it. So keeping all of the power all the way down the line. Now, this was actually pretty inefficient because I want to keep things as objects as far to the existence of the command as I can. I want to send it to text all the way at the end, the furthest to the right. But there's also another rule that in my example, this really isn't that bad. But if I'm going to filter objects, I want to do that as far to the left as I can. So in this example, imagine I was doing other actions. Maybe I was doing a sort object and I was going to do it based on the property of the name. So I've got all these processes, then I'm sorting all of them, and then I'm finding the one with Notepad. Well, that's really wasteful. I'm doing all that computation on a whole lot of objects I really don't care about. Imagine I had multiple Notepad instances running in this thing. Got so many notepads. What would make far more sense would be to actually restrict the number as far to the left, and then I'm saving computation. And the actual best way to do this would be to actually do it in get process itself. It has that ability. And I probably wouldn't be sorting it on the name, I'd maybe sort it by ID. But you get the idea. I want to keep things as objects as long as I can because I get all the rich manipulation of them. If I'm going to filter, reduce the set, I want to try and do that as far to the left as I can because then I'm reducing the number of objects that are going down the pipeline and reducing the amount of resource, the computation required to actually use them. And so I've got 3 notepads running. I can still kill them all. And I can still take text. So if I use, for example, ipconfig, well, ipconfig is just going to spit out a whole bunch of text. So if I do ipconfig and do getMember, what I'm going to get is a string. Doesn't mean I can't do anything with it, but I'm just limited. ipconfig is just a regular exe. It's spitting out a bunch of stuff to the screen, sure. But if I actually want to manipulate that, well, all I can really do are things that manipulate strings. That's really as good as it's going to get. I should point out also we can store things as variables, and I can send those down the pipeline as well. A variable is just something starting with $. This makes it easy to know, hey, look, this is a variable, so what follows of $, is going to be a variable name. So I can say $var1, and that could be a number, it could be a string, it could be an array of strings, it could point to an object. So I could actually say, instead of, so var1 could just be world. And then I could use that. I could say, write output hello var1, which, because it's in double quotes, it will evaluate that variable and expand it. But I could also say, well, my processes equals get process. And then my procs are all of those objects. But these are the actual objects. I still have all the same the same methods that I had before. So if I look at the first one, array item 0, and then, for example, let's do getMember, it's the actual object. It's not a snapshot in time view of it. This is the live object. Likewise, I could go and search that thing. I could send it to other commands. So I have all the same capabilities. So if I want to store something, I can store that in a variable. And if it's an object, I get all the same methods. It's really kind of think of it like a pointer to that actual object. So then we have this pipeline. And obviously we've explored this a lot so far. Within a session, I want to keep all of the output as the objects. That's the output I'm going to get from most commands. It's the object. And these objects, I can pass them down the pipeline. I can manipulate them. I can always check on the type of an object. So I can do get type if I'm storing it in a variable. As we saw, we can also do the getMember, which will also show us the type. So these different ways of working with this. So let's look at a few examples. So we go back over here again. And I think right now we're liking the get process. So if I do my get process, I get all of this different output. And what's happening is it's by default formatting this as a table. It's decided based on the properties that it's being told to display by default. A table is the best way to do that. But it is the objects. I could just as easily format this as a list. There are other types of formatting I could do. I could output it to HTML. There's a whole different set of things I can do. I could add my own names for things. So out of the objects that I'm getting, so if I can do a select object, and I'm doing the long way, you could just type select here. I can say what properties do I want. So I could say the property, I want the name. And I can add my own through hash tables. Everything is PowerShell is a hash table. So a hash table is the @ squiggly bracket or curly bracket. And I can say the name of the new property I want to add could be called, I don't know, proc ID. And its value is going to be controlled by this expression. So I can write code to say how I want to evaluate that. Now I could be lazy. I'm in this case just going to use the object passed, and I'm just going to use the regular ID. So really nothing very interesting. Oh, what did I do? Oh, I did dash instead of equals. There we go. Little typo there. Oh, and I did a comma instead of a semicolon. Lots of mistakes today. There we go. Okay, so I can send it down the line. And now I've got a name and a process ID title. I can really do anything I want with this. So I can always run those expressions as part of the command. That's a more advanced thing, but it can be useful when I think about passing things between different commands. Well, sometimes the output that I'm getting, maybe the names don't match what I'm trying to send it to. And that's going to make a little bit more sense in a second. But those are just some of the things that I can do as part of that basic matching. Because, let's look at something for a second. Let's fire up Notepad again. Now you saw me a little while ago just stop Notepad. And how did I do that? Well, I did a get process, and we'll be more efficient here. Notepad. So there's the process. And I then sent it to stop process. But before we run this command, let's look at something. What I get out of get process is, not surprisingly, a process, as you would expect. Now, if we look at stop process, there's different ways I can call it, different things I can pass. You can see I can pass it an identifier, an ID. I can pass it an object, or I can give it a name. So there's different things. I can send it an integer, an actual process object, or an array of process objects, or an array of strings. So if we actually look at these, so if it's an ID, integer, it does accept it by the pipeline and by property name. So what that means is, by property name means what it's being sent, whatever the object being sent needs to have a property called ID. And it's going to match, hey, this property of what you're sending me, I'm going to match and use as the integer for this. I can also have input object. Now this time, this input object can accept by the pipeline as well. This is by value. And what this means is it's the same type of object that it's expecting. So it's expecting a process. So it doesn't care now about an attribute name or something. It's looking for, if it's passed a process object, well, that matches what it's expecting into input object. And it does accept it by the pipeline. And likewise, I could also send it a string, which is by property name. So it would have to be a property called name in the object that I'm sending it. But as you can guess, what we're doing is, well, we're sending it a process object. So this is the one that's triggering by a value. So this is the one that's being used. It's sending it a process object. And the reason I'm kind of calling this out now is, yeah, this works great because I'm getting a process out and I'm expecting a process in. Now, if the noun is the same, chances are this thing's going to work, i.e. they're both process. Get process, stop process, same noun, process, they're probably going to use the same object. That trick I showed a second ago, where I can add maybe different property outputs, imagine I were using commandlets that for some reason I was actually outputting an object with a bunch of properties, but it doesn't have a property name that the next command is expecting to match by property name. Well, with this, I can add a new property which matches what the next command's expecting to be able to match it. So that's why this is kind of useful. It's a more advanced concept, but that's why we might need to do that. If I'm trying to run something and I can check to see if the command would accept it, this is really useful to come and look at the help. I can work out what am I outputting, and then I can look at the help of what I'm trying to send it to and see, well, how are they going to match? Is it by value? It's the same type of object. If it's not, okay, it's by property name. Well, is there a property coming out of my first command that's going to match the name of the property that it wants? If there isn't, well, I can fake it. I could always kind of force this in. So that's why I was just kind of showing you that there. I mean, there's some crazy things we can do with the pipeline. For example, I could say, well, let's get all my processes where... Now I'm actually going to do the lazy notation here. So the proper notation would be where object $_, because I'm looking at each object piped, because it's outputting a whole bunch of objects. I'm going to look at the number of handles, and if it's greater than 1,000, I want to see them. Well, I can actually just write that. It does exactly the same thing. So that's a lot easier for us to kind of read as human beings. And then I could take that and I could say, well, now I want to sort the objects by the number of handles, and let's format it to a table. I just want the name, the number of handles, and let's auto size that. So I did property handle instead of handles. Not super useful. There we go. So now it's in order. So I can just really use all of these things together. I could run these against multiple machines, and as we'll actually see later on, as I start to think about multiple machines running commands against, this pipeline just continues to grow. There's more and more things I can do with it. Now, I mentioned before we want to try and keep things as objects as long as possible. But there is an end. And so typically at the end of a pipeline, the data is sent to the screen. Now that's if I'm not using it in some other way. I could have a whole pipeline and I could assign it to a variable. Some commands actually have a kind of out variable, so it'll actually send them to a variable at the end without me having to assign it. Or I could just say, well, hey, look, all of this information, there wouldn't be any point formatting it if I was going to keep it actually as an object. There wouldn't be any point really sorting at this point. But I could actually say, well, my process is equals get process where handles is greater than 1,000. Then if I look at that, I only have the ones where it's greater than 1,000. But if I didn't assign it to something, if I did nothing else, ultimately, it's going to end up on the screen. There are various different out verb commandlets. Now the default is out default. And the out default is going to direct to out host. There are other targets. I can go out to a printer. I can do out grid view. I can even do out null. Now it kind of pains me, but to show the grid view, I'm actually have to jump to Windows PowerShell. This isn't available in PowerShell Core today, because the grid view actually brings up a GUI, which is using some of the more standard .NET framework, not .NET Core. So here I'm in regular Windows PowerShell, and I can do get process, and I can say, well, look, let's send it to grid view. And before we do that, let's start up a notepad. And if I run that, it creates this nice little screen, and I can scroll down and I can look, and look, there's my notepad. Just a nice view. I can filter. Okay. Now what I'm going to say is, well, I want you to pass through the object that gets selected, and I'm going to send it to stop process. So now I can scroll around. Remember, there's my notepad still sitting there. Oh, there's notepad. Click OK, and it's gone. So just kind of a neat little way that I can create a mini GUI that I can go and select things and check that. And I can still combine the pipeline with regular commands. So I'm going to kill that off. Let's get rid of Windows PowerShell. So if I went back to my get process, W star this time, I can send that to clip. Clip is just a Windows command, a Windows executable. So if I go notepad and paste, it's in my clipboard now. So another way I can interact, I don't have to exclusively use PowerShell. By the time I get to that text at the end, I could send that to something else. I can combine that and, hey, look, I'll send it to my clipboard. I can send things to files, just like I could do in a regular command session. So I could be over here, and I could say, well, okay, get process, procs.txt, notepad, procs.txt, and there it is. And I can delete it. And what is delete? Well, delete is actually remove item. Not file system specific. I can actually use that across other namespaces. And that's kind of a common thing. We looked at the PS drives. I could use that in the registry. I could use that in my certificate store. I could use that in Azure if I had the Azure ships installed. So just those different namespaces. But in this case, it's a file system, essentially deleting something. Now, what that's actually doing is it's saying out file. So if I did get process, send it down the pipeline to out file, procs.txt, it's doing exactly the same thing. And I could do a get content, and dump it out. Instead of typing get content, you can type cat, and it does exactly the same thing. There's actually a lot of aliases that kind of help if you're more of a Linux person, like ls. If I'm a Linux person, I'm kind of used to doing that. And then I could do that, remove item, procs.txt. So I can send things out just to a regular file. And that's great, but I can do more than that. To have all these capabilities, I can also export. I could format it to a table, I can format it to a list. We've seen that already. I can export out to other formats. So the other formats could be a CSV. It could be an XML file. And when I bring things back, it keeps them as the object. Well, kind of. It's going to vary, and we'll see that now. Let's go over here and we'll do our get process again. And this time we'll export. Before I do that, let's fire up. Actually, no, we won't fire it up yet. There we go. So if we do export to CSV, and we'll do proc.csv. So we're getting a list of the processes, and then it's exporting it out as a CSV file. So if we looked at that file, all the information. If we scroll all the way to the top, we can see there's the names of the various columns. It's all of the different properties. If I was to now bring that back, so if I now did my processes equals import CSV, they're all back again. So it's back as the objects. You can actually see what I've got is a custom object. So it's not just put it now as a basic just bunch of text string. It's brought them back as a set of custom objects that have all of the same properties. Now you might say, well, how could I use that? Now remember, there's different ways we can match commandlets. Remember, there was the by value, there was by property name. So let's start up Notepad. And let's run this again. So it's generating that CSV file. And now what we'll do is we'll import it again. And let's see if we have our Notepad there. So there it is. Okay. Is this going to work? What do we think? And it worked. Well, now, that wasn't the same type of object, remember? If I was to look at this, and notice I can still do this because this is not a live view anymore. This is just a custom object. This is a custom object, so that's not matching at all the input for stop process. If I do get help stop process, I have those different options, but that doesn't work. It's the wrong type of object. But it also accepts something called an ID, the process ID, with an integer. Or it can even accept, and of course I could do a name as a string. But this one's interesting, the ID integer. If I look at all of the properties, well, there's an ID and it has an integer. So that's what happened. It couldn't do the by value, but it did it by property name. So that's why it still kind of worked at that point in time view. Now, that was to a CSV file, and it kept it as an object, but it was a different type of object because CSV is just really a bunch of properties. It can't do much else. What about if we tried exactly the same thing, but this time, what if we send it to XML? XML, obviously, I can have far more descriptions, far more attributes, far more detail about the actual information. So remember last time when it brought it back, it was a PS custom object. It was just creating the object. This time, let's see what it does. So what it would have done is serialize the objects and then send it into that XML. So now, if we do import CLI XML, what do we think? So we look at the processes, though they're all kind of there. And actually the output looks a bit different this time. If we do a get member, got all these properties, note properties, and it's a process, but it's a deserialized process, i.e. it brought it back from the serialized content. It's kind of rehydrated it as a process object, but it's not any kind of live connection anymore to the actual objects. So what that means is you'll notice I've got all the properties and I've got a method of get type into string, but I don't have any other methods. I don't have kill, start, because I'm not linked to live process anymore. It's the information, it's the properties, but I've actually lost it in terms of that kind of live link to the object. And that's actually important because when we start dealing with remote systems, what we get back a lot is deserialized content, which impacts exactly what we can do with it. But it is now an actual real process object again. Now, there may be times that I get way more data back than I actually want. And what I might want to do first is to sort the data that's actually coming in. For example, if I jump over quickly, I can think about, well, if I get my processes, how many do I normally get? So a great commandlet is measure object. So if I just run that, I can see I've got 167 processes coming back. And I could actually look at a particular property that's coming back, for example, the working set, and I could look at the sum, the maximum, the minimum, and the average. And it's giving me details about that particular property. Well, hey, yep, I can see that the average working set size here is kind of, I can't even see how many digits that is, but I don't know, 2 million or 21 million, one of those things. I can see maximum, minimum, so I can get that data about it. There's a lot of things coming in there. So I could just as easily from this say, well, get process, I want to sort them. And I'm doing the longhand, but I could just easily just type sort. And I could sort it by the property, or I could just say working set. So it's sorting them by the working set in here. And you can see they're getting bigger. The other option, I could say, well, actually, I want the biggest ones first. So sort it descending. So it's going to show me those biggest ones first. And now maybe I only care about, for example, maybe the top 5. So then I could say, well, select, and it would be select object, the first 5. So now I've got the biggest processes in terms of working set, and I'm showing those first. So you can see I can limit the objects I'm actually getting back. Now this can be super useful with things like event logs. Now in regular Windows PowerShell, I can do get event log. This is not in PowerShell Core. Now I have a number of options here. I'm going to talk about more of this in the next module. I can actually use a compatibility module to let me load in modules that normally wouldn't run in PowerShell Core. There's actually an alternative. There's actually a get win event that does work in PowerShell Core. From here, I can say, well, log name security. So we type that in. And the switches are a bit different. So here I can actually say, well, the max number of events I want back is 5. And there are some other switches. I can do remotes. I can say I actually want the oldest ones. By default, it's going to give me the newest 5 back. So if I just run that, well then, actually, so I'm trying to run this from a regular PowerShell session. And what it's telling me is that I'm unauthorized. So what I'm going to do is I'll take that command, right click, say run as administrator, paste that in, and now I can run it. So I'm running that elevated. Now we're not really focusing on remote machines yet, but you could imagine I might say if I was running commands on remote machines, and I was going to say, well, I want the same thing. So I'm going to run it on remote computers. And maybe it's my DC1. And we'll say another DC. And then what do I want to run? And I want to run get win event log name security max events 5. And you'll notice what I'm doing here is, remember we think about filtering as far to the left as we can. So I absolutely could have just got all of the events back and then with my select object command, just return 5. But I would have got all that data in, pass it down the pipeline and then have to trim it. So if the command has its own trim capability, I want to do that. So here I ran this command against those remote machines and I got the top 5 security, the most recent 5 back. And I could have done additional filtering on that, but that's the idea. I can limit the objects I'm actually getting back. So that's kind of a key idea when I think about dealing with what can be a huge amount of return value. I actually had a real world example of this recently. So I was in one of my Azure virtual machines and I accidentally disabled the network adapter. And what I wanted to do was essentially send it a command. And what I needed was to find all the network adapters. And then for all the network adapters it had, if it was an Ethernet type, so I would say, well, look, where object, for each of them, remember I'm looking at each past object, where the name was like, starting with Ethernet, and then didn't care, wildcard. So that limited what was returned. Imagine I had lots of objects potentially coming back. Then from that, I sent it to enable net adapter. And then I could run that remotely and enable the NIC, even though I'd kind of lost access to it. So that was a really useful way that I could, hey, look, get all these objects, limit the ones I cared about, and then actually pass that reduced set of objects through to the next command to actually do something really useful. So as we talked about, I can combine it with descending, ascending. I can select the first to last. Looking at the newest 5 processes, I can do measures. But remember, where possible, I'm going to reduce the number as far to the left as possible. If the command to actually go and fetch the objects has its own capability to actually reduce those returns, then let's do that. If it doesn't, then sure, I can use select object to limit that number. But I really want to try and filter it as far to left as I can to just reduce the amount of computation resource required. And remember, I keep it as objects as long as I can so I can do those rich interactions with it. Now, often I want to compare data. There's actually this phenomenal command, compare object. So if I have 2 sets of data, it will look at the 2 sets and then compare them and show me where they're different. And I use this in a lot of different scripts that I write. For example, I have one where I have groups of users in one Azure AD tenant. And what I want to do is use Azure AD B2B to add particular users into another Azure AD tenant. And rather than just blindly doing it, what I do is I fetch the people in the source I want to be B2B'd. Then I fetch the list of people that are currently B2B'd. Then I do a difference between them. And then only the ones that are present on one side do I go and add them. And if they've been removed from the source side, then I remove them from the other side. I also had something where I fetch images from the marketplace for an Azure Stack. Once again, I compare those objects. So this is a super powerful piece of functionality. And I can select how I use this compare. I could, for example, do the property name. So find differences in instances of objects in the results. Otherwise, it's just going to show me any change. So let's look at an example of this. And maybe a good example here is I'll fire up Notepad. And in fact, I'm going to drop out of the elevated one. We'll go back to our normal position here. So Notepad's running. And let's just say $procs equals get process. And then I'll close that down. And we'll say procs2 equals get process. Now I could save this to files. I could do any number of different things. But at this point, I can say compare object. My reference object, I could say is procs. My difference object, I could say is procs2. And the thing I want to compare is the property name. And here it's showing me, well, look, in one of them, in procs, well, it had something called Notepad. It's showing me the side indicator showing me, hey, look, the first one you specified the reference, it had Notepad, which wasn't in the other one. Likewise, I could fire up other things. So if we fired up, for example, I'm not even sure what's on Windows 10 these days. If we find calculator, that's going to be a modern app, so that's not quite sure what it's going to do. Let's see what we find though. We'll soon find it. So we've updated procs2 with the current list. If we compare it again, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff has changed. So I can see, well, look, I'm still missing Notepad, and I'm missing a WMI app service, but now I have calculator, I have some runtime brokers, I have all these weird things have changed, because now the timer's got longer as well. Things happen just in Windows. So it's showing me all the things that are being changed behind the scenes. And think about, I could use this for an array of names. I could use it for Azure AD accounts. There's really no limit, but it's super powerful. And I can use that side indicator to work out, well, where is it, where isn't it, and then act on that accordingly. I can do far more advanced type output. And I started to touch on this with the XML. So I can convert to HTML, to JSON, to CSV, to XML, to secure strings. I could combine that with outfile to actually send it to a file. So there's a huge amount of work I can do here. And there's some really clever things I can do. For example, I can actually understand XML. PowerShell has an XML type. So I could import a large XML file, and I could manipulate that. I could look at the individual elements of it. For example, I've written code in the past to insert a particular component into an XML file using PowerShell. So realize you have all of these things available to you. So what can I do with these? I mean, I can output to a file, it's great, but ideally I want to keep them together. I'm going to chain these commandlets. And I need to be able to accept as input objects from the previous commandlet in the pipeline. But you have to be careful, and I previously showed you how to check, well, what is a commandlet expecting to get by doing the get helpful. And I can do a get member on the output from a commandlet to see, well, what is it outputting? So can I send it down the pipeline and match by value? Was it by property name? But really be careful. For example, I could run get process, stop process. What would this do? Let's run it. Get process, stop process. And I'm going to add what if, because I'm not that stupid. And it's like, oh, it stopped everything, and it would have crashed. So what if's really nice, because it's going to say, hey, look, here's what I would have done. I would have run stop on all of these different things. Now, I'm not elevated, so it should have limited what would have happened. My PowerPoint would have stopped. Some various things would have stopped. I don't think it would have crashed the OS, but honestly, I'm not going to risk it. So that would have been a very bad day for John. I could also do things like, well, a particular process, get process of a certain name, stop that process. And we've kind of seen that. So I can fire up Notepad, and there's Notepad running. Actually, I'm going to kill off calculator. So I could do, well, get process. And again, I'm going to try and filter as far to the left as I can. So that would just get Notepad. And now I can send that to stop process. And the reason that works, remember, is because if I do a get member, it's outputting. Oh, that's gone, so it's not going to do much useful at all. But if I just do get process, its output is going to be a process object. And if I do get help, get process full, this is always what I want to do to check things are going to chain. If I look at the types of object this can accept, or what it can accept, well, one of these is actually a get process. I can receive an input object of type process. So that's what I'm going to actually get here. So I can see an input object, and it's going to accept from the pipeline. Yep, and it's doing it by value. So if I send it an object of type process, it will match here, send it through. That's why it's working. So I can always go and check and work out, well, why is this not passing the way I think it should? Hey, look, let's go and look. And I can work it out super quick. With pass-through, for example, disable AD account, I could carry on passing the object down the pipeline. Now I've got nothing after disable AD account here, but if I did, I could get the user, disable it, and then maybe there's another command, maybe go and disable an exchange mailbox. So it gives me the ability to keep the pipeline going, even if ordinarily the command would have kind of stopped the pipeline. Confirm and what if, you've kind of seen this already. So I can add these two commands. Confirm will prompt before it's doing an action. What if would tell me what it's going to do without actually doing it. For example, get all of the users in AD and then remove them all. What if? I.e., please don't do that. That would be another bad day for John. So if I was to jump over for a second, and we'll say enter a PS session on computer name, SAP Azure, a domain controller. So I could do get AD user, filter all, properties, last logon date. So it's going to give me the last logon date of every user. And I could say, look, I want to see everyone where that last logon date is less than or equal to the current time, add some days, minus 60. So I'm adding minus 60. Show me anything where that particular user hasn't logged on for 60 days. And I want to sort them by that last logon date and show it in a descending order. Then let's format it in a table. So I could say format table or just FT. And I want to see the name and the last logon date. That's it. And auto size it for me. So I can see, hey, look, the people that haven't logged on for 60 days is Clark Kent. Hasn't logged on since the 12th of September. The others have never logged on. So really powerful here. Again, remember trimming and reducing down what I'm seeing. But I could then say, well, I'll tell you what, let's disable all of those. But I don't want to, so I'm going to say what if. And that errored because... So remember, what did I do? I had objects, and then I formatted it as a table. Well, it doesn't want to be sent strings. I need to remove the formatting, so I'm just sending it down the line. So now I've actually got the objects to then disable the account. And there we go. It would have disabled those accounts. And you notice I make mistakes. I'm demoing. I'm not going to edit these things out. Things happen. It's okay. Jeffrey Snover, kind of the inventor of PowerShell, will often say in his talks, he's like, look, I'm a flawed human being, like we all are. he designed PowerShell to be able to handle those things. It's very forgiving. Now, you want to be super careful when you're deleting things and removing things. Make sure you have the what ifs and the confirms. But you're going to make mistakes. You want test environments. That's where we learn. Make sure we use these confirm and the what ifs. But it's okay. We kind of all have to learn these things. So more on the confirm. So what confirm is doing is, you'll notice I'm not always being prompted when I do certain things. When I stopped Notepad, for example, it's not asking me to confirm. And so every commandlet has a certain impact level. So if the impact level is equal or higher than the confirmation preference setting, it's going to prompt me. So I have this confirm preference. So if I go and look at confirm preference, mine is set to high. So only if it is a high impact, it's actually going to ask me to confirm. And I can always override that by adding confirm false. So let's take a look. Let's start Notepad. Okay, so I'm still on the domain controller, so that's not a good thing. So what I actually want to do is exit out of this and kill this. So it's actually trying to start. I'm forgetting where I am. Very dangerous. It is telling me, hey, look, you're on the domain controller, but that's why it can't start Notepad. I'm trying to start it interactively. Good lesson here. Always be aware of where you are. So that came back. I actually cheated. I went actually jumped over and I killed my remote process on that box. So it was just hanging. Anyway, my confirm preference is high. So if I started Notepad and I did my get process, and remember, I can do name Notepad, or if I was being silly, I could just get all of them and I could say, well, I'll pass it down the pipeline for each object passed to me if the name equals Notepad. And you'll notice we do -EQ rather than equals, because I can use this as a script or interactive, and equals can mean assigning as well, so it can get very confusing for the interpreter. That's why it actually uses -EQ. So there's my process, and I can do stop process. And does it prompt me? No, because the impact level here is not high. I'm going to guess it's medium. So if I was to, once again, we'll start another Notepad, but this time we'll set our confirm preference to medium. And we'll run that command again. Now it's prompting me. Because the stop process is medium impact, my confirm preference is medium, so it's making me accept it. Likewise, if I start another Notepad, and I do stop process, and I say confirm false, it just stops it. It's saying, don't ask me. I know what I'm doing. Just, you can go ahead and kill that thing. So I'm going to change my confirm preference back to high. And we're good to go. I've covered this a few times now. Get member is your friend. Get member or just GM, that's kind of an alias. It will show me all the properties, all the methods for that particular object. So it's an easy way to find out exactly what I can do. Now, you've seen me a few times do $_. And I kind of explained it as, well, look, when I get these objects and they're passed from one command down the pipeline, $_ represents each object that is sent to me. So if I was sent 100 objects, $_ represents each of those 100 one at a time. So I can evaluate, do various functions, comparisons, operations on it. So it gives me the ability to examine those objects. So $_ represents the current pipeline object, and I can then access various attributes through that. And you've seen me do that. get all the processes, and then where object, so for each of them that's passing down, I want to look at the name of the object. So $_ is the object, dot means I want to access a property or method of it. In this case, it's property name. If it equals notepad, then I want to do something with that. Likewise, I can really do anything I want here. For example, if I do get service, where the status equals stopped. So I'm going to go and get all the services. And I missed out the double quote, which is why it's sitting there wanting me to do something. So get service, where, and I'm typing where, it's actually where object, remember, but I can just do where $_.status equals stopped. So these are all stopped. And I could say, start them all. And I don't want to do that. But what it would have done is start all of those things, which again, I think would be a pretty bad day. And just a quick note here, help is your friend. So if you're wondering, like I'm doing -eq, I can do get help on wildcard operators. And again, I keep forgetting to do things here. So wildcard operators, wildcard. And it's going to find all the help for the various operators. So I can see there's about assignment, comparison, logical. So now I can say, okay, well, show me all the help on comparison. Okay, so it's going to give me examples. I can do replacements here. Huge amounts of information. So definitely go and have a look. And again, obviously online. Online there's a ton of great information, but I can say, well, equals, 2 equals 2, 2 equals 3, 1, 2, 3 equals 2, etc. So that's a good way to actually just go and get help out anything I'm trying to do here. Now there is another syntax available. $_ maybe seems confusing. So I can also do, yep, there's my standard $_. Or I can use PS item instead of $_, same thing. Or with PowerShell 3 and above, I can just skip the PS item or the $_ completely. I can skip the squiggly brackets and just type what I want to do. It's far more readable. Notice in my example, I could still do get process, or I could do GPS, which is an alias. I prefer to use $_, but I'm old and I'm set in my ways. Now, another thing you can do is sometimes you'll see a bit of code and you're like, what is that doing? So you might see like a get process and you'll see a question mark. And you might see like handle count greater than 1,000. Question mark is just an alias for where object. If I do a get alias question mark, there we go. In fact, if we look at get alias for a second, there's another very popular one we'll see at the start. There's a for each object. For each is very commonly used where I've maybe got an array of objects and I want to do some set of actions for each of them. For example, I've got a list of users, I want to call a piece of code, and then for each object, I can set a name for each individual object passing through the flow and perform a whole set of actions on it. So I can do the % for that. So you might see those two things in code. That's super common. So here's some kind of advanced $_ use I've had in the past. So here is that XML example I kind of talked about. I had an unattended answer file. I read it in to an XML variable, casting it by doing the square bracket XML. So I get the content, GC is an alias for get content. And then what I'm actually doing here is I create a new object, an element called time zone. And I set that to Central Standard Time. I then basically walk through the settings part of the XML of the unattended section And if the pass equals, so $_, I'm looking at the child essential components of settings. If it equals out of box experience system, I add in my new setting, which was time zone to Central Standard Time. And I save it out to a new file. Also here, for example, I'm getting all of the resource providers. And then if it's of type virtual machines, I spit out the locations. So there's some super cool stuff I can do. There's just some examples I've used in the past. So coming up next, we're going to deal with remote management. Remember to go to the GitHub site to get all the sample code. I've also got the slide handouts. I've got some example unattended, that XML example I just gave. That's that example file. All of the PowerShell I'm showing is in the samples. You can go and grab this along with the handouts. I've also now got a link to the playlist. So as I add new videos, I'll be adding it to the YouTube playlist. And again, I've got the instructions for actually getting the clone. And again, this page will grow over time. For example, in the next session, we'll talk about Linux deployment. So you'll see, maybe by the time you're looking at this right now, I'll have a few more links, for example, to, hey, how do I install the Linux PowerShell instance? How do I enable it? So I'll just be building this over time. And over here on the playlist, you can see right now I've just got the first module. By the time you're looking at this now, you'll see module 2 is up there. And I'm just going to keep growing this over time. And I'm going to have them in the order I recommend. And I may insert new modules at certain points if something cool new comes up. So just keep an eye on it and I'll tweak those things. But the GitHub is kind of your main entry point, and I'm linking to all the materials, and you can clone this to get local copies. Hope this was useful. I'll see you on the next module. Thank you.